All right, welcome to the show today. I have my friend Austin Lowe's on. Welcome, Austin, to the show. Good to
Thank you.
have you on.
Good to be on.
It's nice to have some pleasant weather rather than it being minus 10 all the time and being buried to our knees in snow. It's definitely a relief.
I hear you on that, man. It's beautiful out today.
It is. I took advantage of it a little earlier, probably go for a walk a little bit later. But anyways, let's dive into what's going on down south in Texas and Mississippi. They recently changed the restrictions so that there's now 100% capacity in businesses and there's no mask mandate. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think to jump into that already is a little premature. Of course, we're getting a slowdown in cases that can be attributed to mostly the lockdown measures as well as the vaccine rollout. So I think it's premature. I think it's sort of akin to uh, you know saying, okay, well, I've deployed my parachute enough. We're slowing down a bit. Okay, scrap the parachute. I don't think it's a very smart move. I don't think that it really follows the established science. I think that it's a case of the governor Greg Abbott specifically saying this has gone on too long, and regardless of what the science may say, or regardless if this is considered a good idea, we're going to go ahead and open up. And I know that people's frustrations are palpable. I completely understand after a year of quarantine and going crazy being inside. I get it, but I think now is the time to really push hard. Crack down on these things, bring our caseloads way down, and then start having a conversation about opening. To the extent they're saying, whether or not there's some states that are looking at say 25% capacity, or they're opening limited amenities and these kinds of things. I think that that's a much more measured, gradual approach that's probably more in line with the science. Of course, the idea of opening concert venues to 100% is a lot different than, just letting people gather with their buddies in a backyard. So I think that these states should continue to, impose mask mandates as necessary, and, impose any sort of capacity restrictions that they feel are necessary to slow the spread of this.
Okay, those are some pretty interesting points you make. Now, with the more gradual opening up, there are some states that are taking a more gradual approach, like New York City and New Jersey
You're right.
restaurants,
Yeah.
for example. They're going to be allowed to open at half capacity. And California, they also are planning to open their theme parks soon, including Disneyland. That's going to happen on April 1st. So even in the more states that have been kind of known to be strict with COVID, they're starting to even open up a little bit too. But I mean, it's hard to say whether or not this is a good idea. I mean, it would be nice to believe that this could work, that this could be
Oh yeah,
successful.
for sure.
I mean, they make the point of the vaccine rollout in their favor of reopening. They make that one of their main arguments, I think.
Yeah.
But then there's a lot of health experts also saying that even with the vaccine, we still need to be cautious.
Yeah, and I think it's just, I mean, much of it boils down to people's impatience, and I understand the difficulty presented in attempting to balance the economic interests of a state with the health interests. And I totally understand where people are coming from when they say, we can't keep small businesses closed forever. We can't, allow people to lose their, means of survival, especially if that's not coupled with a proper government response. If people are basically just being hung out to dry, unable to make money, but not receiving support, you're basically forcing people into poverty, and so that's obviously not a good thing. So when you talk
So
about,
what? Sorry,
sorry,
go
what's
ahead.
that? I was just going to say, in terms of California, I think maybe opening Disneyland April 1st, that's a little premature. I think even with capacity restrictions, um, I think ultimately the issue is when you give people an inch, they take a mile, right? We've seen time and time again, especially in the states, just given the fiercely individualistic nature of the people there, that uh, considering other people's welfare at a perceived expense to somebody, isn't worth it to them, right? And if so, if you're peddling masks as help other people, that's not a very enticing argument to much of Americans, to much of America. Um, uh, yeah, I
Do
think
you
that
think
there.
attitude towards masks has changed over time in America compared to the start of the pandemic? Do you think people are more accepting of it now?
I struggle. I don't necessarily think they're more accepting. I kind of look at, so for example, they're coming out with these smart masks, which they, want to integrate into other technologies. And I just don't think that that's the kind of thing that would ever take off because it's sort of like an implicit admission that this is now part of our lives. If we're looking to integrate these technologies into a mask, that we're basically saying this is here to stay. And I know that you're going to get a lot of pushback on that from Americans. And I just
Yeah.
don't think that while we may say it's our new normal, it's pretty clear that most people are still not in favor of the masks. And even if you are in favor of the masks, you'd prefer not to wear one. You wear one because you feel a duty to, and you feel that it's necessary and it'll protect you and protect others. But at the end of the day, we all want to get back to a point where we're not doing that. So, whether or not people have just said, hey, you know, I guess I'll deal with it. That's one thing. But as far as acceptance or a changing, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. I'm not. We should edit this
No, that's all
out.
right.
Yeah,
Oh
no.
no, that's good. Good. We can keep rolling with this.
Mm.
Now, what do you think like a worst case scenario could be in Texas? Or it looks like by the statistics, Mississippi has been hit harder in terms of the actual death rate by population because I was looking into the statistics a little bit earlier. Texas doesn't seem all that worse from states like California or New York, but Mississippi does seem like they're a little bit more impacted.
Well, that's the interesting thing is you have to also look at the economic status of each one of those. Texas is America's second or third largest economy behind California. Whereas Mississippi basically ranks last in pretty much any metric you want to measure by, right? Whether it's education, whether it's infrastructure, any of those things, even just tax bases, they don't pull in the revenue that Texas does. And in turn, what happens there is you have, less of a social safety net for people, right? So you have people that are more willing to suck it up and tough it out and say, hey, this business is my livelihood. The government's not going to help me at all. Screw these mask mandates, screw these capacity restrictions. We're going to go, plug ahead. And it's also been an issue in a lot of countries other than the U.S., especially I was reading about in Peru. So Peru instituted a lot of coronavirus control measures such as mask mandates. But one of the biggest problems is approximately 40% of that country doesn't have refrigeration. So even though they did something similar to us where they said, okay, groceries and a few other select businesses are deemed essential, the problem
Yeah.
was you had people who needed to go out and get food on a daily or, every other day basis. So they were just immediately, in these open air markets with thousands of other people who were in the same position where they couldn't stay at home and they couldn't just refrigerate their food and tough it out for a week. So it really does come down to sort of the socioeconomic status of whatever area you're talking about. Yeah, like I said, Texas, it's big cities like Dallas, Austin, San Antonio. Uh, they're whether you want to bring the politics into it or not. Typically those states are Democratic controlled. We've seen as a whole in America that Democratic states are more likely to lock down, whether or not the science says they should, or whether or not the measures that they're doing are overkill or not. But you are seeing, I think a more concerted control effort in those big city centers. So that helps things a lot. Whereas Mississippi, I mean, you have a couple big cities in Mississippi, but certainly nothing of the scale of a Dallas or Austin or San Antonio. So,
What are some large cities in Mississippi? There's none that really come to mind for me. I don't know the state very well.
Jackson, I think would probably be one of your biggest ones. But really, when we talk about big, we're certainly not talking on the scale of these big metropolitan areas, or even something like, say, New Orleans and in Louisiana, which is just neighboring Mississippi. Um, yeah, it's just really depends, on your criteria. But overall, those states are more rural, and what we've seen with the rural communities is they've actually been the hardest hit, whether that's just by nature of them being more remote. Vaccine access and distribution is a big concern, within these towns of 200 people. Stereotypically, they're not people that are really gung ho about adhering to these measures. They may not think they're necessary because they're in an area with very few cases. Whether or not they're considering, the potential for those cases to grow and for their communities to be hard hit doesn't really seem to be as much of a concern to them. So yeah, there's quite a few differences, but I definitely think that the main one is going to be just the economic status of the country, and or not the country, but the state rather, and that'll inform sort of the response to the coronavirus.
And do you think as well what type of industries are more dominant in the state would have an impact too? Like maybe states with more of a larger service-based industry or maybe
Yeah,
like a larger retail industry would be more harder hit
yeah, for sure.
or
And
a
then
big restaurant.
that's also exacerbating the inequalities between ethnic groups. So, for example, when you talk about essential services, so say you're talking about grocery store workers in the U.S., predominantly you're going to have more Latino and Black people in those industries. And of course, when you're dealing with being on the front lines of this pandemic, your potential for exposure is much higher. You really are just at a higher risk. And so if you're talking about industries that are more white dominated, sort of more the white collar or industries that are able to adapt to this and work from home, you just don't get as many exposure potentials. And that's really showing itself in the inequality in America. And it's sad to see because these are all things that can be rectified by fixing these inequalities in other matters because it's not a case by case problem, it's a systemic problem.
What do you think could be done?
Well, I mean, you have just even just talking about like access to education, talking about the funding of public schools. One of the biggest issues with America, and it is sort of by design historically, is that property taxes fund schools. And so, in a very wealthy neighborhood, which would be considered predominantly white, you have a much larger tax base to draw from, and you have better schools. But say you're talking about an inner city Detroit school where the neighborhood around the school is just full of disadvantaged people, there's no tax base there. And because there's no tax base, the school gets no funding. And because the school gets no funding, you have no teachers. And especially when you're talking about an area where a teacher's life could be at risk, in certain interactions with students, it's not worth, being paid 30 grand a year to potentially take a bullet. And so these are all factors that compound themselves and build upon themselves and leave people more ill-equipped for society or reduce their opportunities because they haven't been given other opportunities, especially in
So
education.
based on that, would you say it's a problem that's getting progressively worse as time goes on, unless somebody intervenes?
Well, I think as society understands the root of these problems and understands that these inequalities aren't in your face inequalities, right? It's not as simple as, oh well, this law, we can't write laws that say you can discriminate against black people, therefore black people aren't being discriminated against. It's like, well, no. You have to look at the more underlying issues. And although we're becoming a society that's much more accepting and certainly not as discriminatory against those groups of people, there's still a lot of progress to be made. And I think just anecdotally, but you look at Detroit, their revitalization over the past decade or so has really helped bring up and reduce that inequality by also, providing opportunities to those who really didn't have them, predominantly black people in that area. So I think it's a problem that is getting progressively better, but I don't think it's one that's been solved. And I think that there are some people that are of the mind that it is solved, and I just don't see any evidence of that.
Okay, you make some good points. Going back to Texas and Mississippi with what they're doing in response to COVID, if it turns out that they don't experience a huge surge in cases, if this is kind of a successful experiment, you could say, what do you think that could mean for the rest of the country and the rest of the world?
Well, I mean, in the absolute off chance that that is the case, I think it doesn't send a good message in the sense of like when you look at around the world, we're not doing this for shits, right? Like we're not doing this just for fun. There's a whole bunch of case studies or specific little areas where they didn't impose a mask mandate, they didn't impose capacity restrictions, they didn't do anything, and they're completely fine. Right in the beginning stages of the pandemic, a lot of people were looking towards Sweden because Sweden didn't impose widespread COVID control measures, and basically they operate on this herd immunity response, which of course was used as ammo by the people who didn't want to lock down and stuff. But then eventually it caught up with them, right? And then specifically talking about Texas, their governor, Greg Abbott, he specifically resisted any sort of mask mandate or control measures in the beginning of the pandemic and only instated them once the ICUs and nursing homes were above capacity. So it seems like the reality of the situation, just doesn't match up with what they're expecting, and it's forcing them into a position that they don't want to be in. And so I think it's a cautionary tale. To me, I just think they've gone through this before. They've seen that it doesn't work. But now a year later, a year into this, they're saying, hey, we're sick of it, and we don't particularly care if the science says it's okay. We're going to open up. I don't know.
So you think it has more to do with maybe what they call pandemic fatigue rather than them actually genuinely thinking that this is a good idea?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think that for a lot of states, their decisions haven't been guided by healthcare professionals or by those in health authorities. So I think that I mean it just seems like regardless of what the science says, they're going to do what they want. If it leads to a good outcome, they'll tout it as just saying, hey, it's not all necessary. But I think that just causes more problems because even if in the off chance a system like that worked in Texas, it's not necessarily going to work in California. It's not necessarily going to work in New York. But people are going to think it will. And then they're going to open up those places, and then caseloads are going to increase, and ICUs will get over capacity. And then, you're basically back to square one. And so I think that what should be done here is to exercise caution. Of course, going back to what I said before, you just need to take a science-based approach, take a gradual approach. And the problem is that at the end of the day, you can't rely on people to police themselves. That's why we have mask mandates. That's why we have, when you travel outside of Canada and you come back, you got to quarantine for 2 weeks, and it comes at your expense because at this point the government's saying, why are you traveling, right? The government's not saying, hey, you can't travel, but they're saying if you travel, these are the consequences. And I think people are just getting very sick of this, and I'm one of them. But I recognize that the response to getting sick of this isn't to just say, well, screw it. We'll open up back up fully and just try to go about our lives. Because at the end of the day, nobody wants to get sick, right? It's one thing to say, hey, I don't think the world should get shut down. But it's another thing to say, hey, yeah, I'm willing to feel like complete shit for weeks. It's just not, and it's something that I think if anyone was actually in that position, they wouldn't want. But because it's this abstract thing that they believe is only going to happen to somebody else, and they're being penalized for something that won't happen to them, they think it's BS. And I just don't think that that's very fair.
Well, and I remember you mentioned before the show about like lingering symptoms that some people experience with
Yeah.
COVID, and that's certainly of concern as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about things like loss of taste, like that's a major loss. It's one thing to get influenza as a normal, healthy, non-immunocompromised person and feel like crap for a week or two, but it's another thing to say, hey, I'm going to get this disease that could potentially leave me without the sense of taste for the rest of my life. And
Yeah.
and personally, I'm not somebody who's going to take that risk, unnecessarily.
Yeah, I've heard stories about the loss of sense of taste. Like I was listening to somebody talk about how they experienced that symptom, and just to see how serious it was, they tried drinking some pickle juice, I believe, and they
Okay.
couldn't taste anything. It was like water to them. They just couldn't taste a thing.
Yeah, and I mean, food is
That's
one
kind
of
of
my
mind
great
blowing.
passions in life, so it's certainly not something I would want to go without or not be able to enjoy the way I'd like.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that would be in the same boat for sure, and I think that you could also lose your sense of smell as well,
Yeah, well, and then
which not,
they're interconnected, right? So,
yeah.
it's like if you plug your nose while you eat something, you don't taste it.
I mean, losing your sense of smell could even potentially be dangerous because what if you're near some kind of chemical and you can't smell that,
Natural gas leak in your house and you can't smell it. Could
right?
be an issue. Yeah.
That's a possibility. Now, going to California, and we talked a little bit about how they're going to open theme parks and loosen things up a little bit, but there's a lot of people leaving the state. A couple big names like Elon Musk and Joe Rogan have recently left, claiming that the reason for doing so is really related to the high taxes in the state as well as the overregulation.
Yeah. Well, I think, as far as the mass exodus to Californians, because as we saw the data earlier, that California actually is ranked lowest in the states out of all states in terms of net domestic migration. So they're second in international migration. So it's kind of still kind of the premier destination for those coming from outside of the country. But for those in the country, yes, they're leaving it. And now I guess the question is, given the timing of it and given how California's sort of not always been, but been for the last 15 years or so, it's tough to attribute it to a single thing. Like, of course, there are people that want to get away from the higher taxes in California.
Right.
And I suppose, I guess maybe more in terms of Elon Musk and people who are business leaders, that's when regulation would come in more so. But I also think that it's tough to decouple that from California's insane cost of living. It's kind of like, well, if I want to live in San Francisco, I basically have to be making $300,000 a year US to have any sort of decent life. And that's not realistic for a lot of people. And then they recognize, my money goes so much further. And it goes a lot further in neighboring states, right? So one of the big implications of this is sort of Arizona turning purple politically, going from red to, a mix of red and blue. Because the people leaving California, they may not desire the taxes or they may not like the regulation and stuff, but they go to Arizona because they like the weather, because it's basically the same. They don't sacrifice that. Their money goes so much further, and then their political leanings are their political leanings. And so I think that that's another one of the sort of implications of the Cal exit or whatever name they give to it.
Now, you mentioned the cost of living. Do you think that such a high cost of living contributes to California's homeless problem? And you mentioned before the show as well, like it also has to do with them closing the asylums.
Yeah. And so, yeah, of course, like, if you're talking about a barrier to entry of 300 grand in income to be able to live a decent life, the homeless folk aren't panhandling that much, that's for sure. So,
No.
yeah, I mean, you're talking about a problem that doesn't really have a quick fix. It's interesting that California, is a state that has quite a safety net. So I think under normal circumstances, if there was a normal, cost of living aspect coupled with, a government that provides for its citizens, that things would be a lot better. But when you have a runaway cost of living, that's a huge issue. But going back to the discussion about the asylums, you know, at the end of the day, asylums really were a place where you could keep someone who was a danger to themselves or a danger to society locked away indefinitely at taxpayer cost, of course, but in a capacity where they weren't going to hurt somebody. And I think that when you release those, patients, and they're not prisoners, basically prisoners, but patients, when you release those patients into the broader society and don't provide them any sort of support, or they don't have any family or friends that can take care of them, you're just creating a problem. You're not saying, hey, the treatment in the asylum is inhumane. We need to do better for these people, and this is how we do it. It was kind of more of like, get the hell out. And I think that is obviously lacks compassion, but it also lacks any sort of practical solution to the problem, because you're just basically saying, you're throwing them to the wolves and saying, fend for yourself, which, of course is fine if you're talking about somebody who's, perfectly mentally able, physically capable, all these things. It's significantly easier to pick yourself up and kind of make a name for yourself or make a good living. But you're talking about people that have physical impairments or mental impairments trying to make it in a society that gives them no tools. And I think it was just a very unfair thing to do. But of course, it's not unique to California. Like in California, it was when Reagan was governor, I think in the 60s. But we see it in Canada too, because we saw the problem of asylums as kind of an inhumane place to lock people up like animals.
Yeah.
But then we didn't shut them down and allow a transition of these people into normal life. So I think that there's a failing there.
It's hard to say. Like the asylums themselves gain such a notorious reputation, but also at the same time, you can't just send them out onto the street to do whatever they please, because I mean, if they can't take care of themselves, it's pretty inevitable that they're either going to hurt themselves or maybe inadvertently hurt other people.
Exactly. Yeah.
Need some kind of support system to at least point them, at the very least, point them in the right direction and offer them some kind of guidance.
Yeah, and I think by mentioning, inadvertently hurting other people, you really speak to the heart of the problem, or why people should care about the problem. it's one thing to not necessarily have compassion to those who are homeless and are doing harm to themselves. But as members of society, we don't want to be adversely affected by people who are disadvantaged, right? It's like when you lack a social safety net at all and people have no money, they turn to crime. And who are the victims of the crime? Those who have money, those who have things, right? Property crimes, violent crimes. All these things happen to the upstanding members of society when they say, why the hell should I care about this homeless junkie? And it's like, well, it's almost for your own sake that you should care.
Well, what's really interesting about the sort of property crimes you mentioned is it's actually lower income people who are more affected by these kinds of crimes because the people who are higher income, they can usually afford better security measures and better
That's true.
preventative
Yep.
sort of security to just prevent them becoming a target. Because
Yeah.
these criminals, they're looking for the easiest target they can find.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, if they're already in a lower income environment, of course, the people in that environment with them would be, I guess, the most likely targeted. I just think that there's the ones who might need a bigger score or something that would set off to more affluent neighborhoods and, steal things from there. Um, but yeah,
It would
like,
depend on for sure.
yeah,
Because people steal for different reasons too. I mean, some
exactly.
people simply do it out of desperation.
Oh, exactly.
There's other people who do it more out of because they actually get some kind of enjoyment out of it.
Yeah, I'm definitely speaking more about those who are doing it out of necessity, right? I
Of
mean, if
course.
you're talking about depriving people of their needs, it's like it's kind of like the ultimate ethical dilemma. It's like if you're stealing bread to feed you and your starving daughter, is that unethical? And it's like, well, of course stealing is bad, but you empathize with it because you understand that if they didn't do that, that they would die or that they would be, in a situation where there's no way out.
It's kind of both ethical and unethical at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess you have to balance which one outweighs the other. And if it's the case of starvation, then obviously I think that you could definitely easily forgive somebody who's
Oh, for
simply
sure.
trying to feed their family versus somebody who's breaking into, say, like a luxury goods store and just stealing some sneakers or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, and then you have people who riot and take advantage of that and say, "Hey, I'm gonna, cart out this flat screen TV," and it's like,
We
you're not
saw a lot of
gonna
that.
sympathize with that, right? You're not gonna respect that.
We saw lots of that last summer for sure, all over the United States. Lots of people taking advantage of the unrest. I mean, they're not necessarily affiliated with anybody who's actually there for a
No.
purpose. They're just there because they know that there's an opportunity to
Yeah.
take things
In a way
with all
to
the chaos.
avoid accountability and just kind of get lost in the mob and remain anonymous almost.
And then people end up just pointing the finger at somebody else usually, rather
Yeah.
than the actual people who are responsible.
Or it detracts from the movement, and then everyone says, "Hey, it's not about, in this case, Black Lives Matter. It's about, you just want to break stuff and steal stuff." And it's like, well, no, there are people that do want to do that, of course, but
Yeah.
that's not the main focus. And of course, you have to be someone who condemns that, but also makes sure to, not allow people to entirely associate your movement with the bad apples.
I've heard like the tricky thing with Black Lives Matter is it lacks like a really formal structure. So it's easy for people to kind of take advantage of it and just
Yeah.
kind of like, I guess, blend in with them when they're demonstrating.
Yeah, because there's Black Lives Matter the movement and there's Black Lives Matter the organization, which is slightly different than what people consider Antifa, which isn't necessarily a centralized thing. It's just more of an idea, which then of course becomes more difficult to target, or
Yeah.
to really look at because you can say that the idea of it's good, but then if you look at what an organization saying that they adhere to that idea or whatever, when you look at what they're doing, you know that's when you can kind of say, hey, no, I don't agree with that, or I don't agree with your methodologies, or this is wrong. Um, Whereas, nobody can look at the movement and say the premise of this is bad, but it's the execution that matters, and it depends on who's participating and how they participate, what they do, all
Those
those.
are good points. Because a lot of people would just generally condemn Antifa for sure, just based on some of the behavior of their members. But I would say, I mean, there probably is some diversity within the group, like in terms of what people believe is the best way to carry out what they believe. I mean,
Yeah,
there's definitely evidence of people that are willing to go and resort to violence, but
yeah.
then there's also the people that would be more in favor of opening a dialogue with somebody, or at least I
Yeah.
would hope that's the case.
And
Because
I think it's important for
I,
people to not, I think if you have these pockets of violence or you have these one-off instances, I think it's really ignorant to just point at that and say, okay, this is why we can tune the rest of it out, right? But it's equally important for the members of that movement to condemn those who act in those ways and perpetuate those behaviors, because otherwise they give their movement a bad name. And if you're really passionate about something that you believe in, you don't want that tainted by somebody who says, "Oh, well, I guess it gives me a reason to hurl a brick through a window." You know.
do you think groups on the other side of the political spectrum, say like the Proud Boys, for example, do they have a similar problem that Antifa has?
I mean, I think it's significantly more pronounced on the right as far as the Proud Boys go, but I just think that it's like it needs to be coupled with condemnation of that bad behavior. And so, I haven't seen much of that really on the right. I see a lot more like downplaying of the instances where things were bad. And I think that that's wrong regardless of who does it. You know what I mean? Like if people are detracting from your movement and you don't believe that they represent you, you shouldn't be trying to minimize their actions because then it just sounds like you're defending them. Like you
Mhm.
shouldn't be, oh, it wasn't that bad. And it's like, well, I mean, other people would disagree, so
I think
I just
Donald
think
Trump
that,
was give that a lot of times. That's something that he made the mistake of doing quite a few times, like with I think Charlottesville was one of the main
yeah,
examples, right? Like
it's just
do
such a
a clear
softball
job.
political issue. Like it's just to me it's just something it's what politicians crave, right? The ability to denounce an idea or denounce an organization that 90% of people disagree with, right? You shouldn't be concerned about alienating voters, right? If you're concerned about alienating voters by speaking out against white supremacists,
Yeah.
that doesn't look good, So I think that he fumbled the ball on that because it's just such an easy thing to say. And to me, that it made it look like he was looking out for more of his own political interests, which again, going back to what I said, is strange. You shouldn't be courting people who are out and proud white supremacists, people that are chanting, anti-Semitic slogans, all these kinds of things. Like, and then for people to say, or to give him an opportunity to do so at a later date, and then he goes, "I already did." It's kind of like, dude, it shouldn't be like pulling teeth to say screw Nazis.
He's just
Like it
really
doesn't look
stubborn.
good. Yeah, it's just I don't
When
know.
people tell him to do something, he just doesn't want to do it. He would do it on his own, probably. If you told him not to do it, he would probably do it. But it seems like whenever the press asks him to do something, he just doesn't want to.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, it's like I just don't understand the opposition to it because the thing about Trump that I've just never understood is that he's such a narcissist in the sense that he cares so much about how he's perceived, but then he doesn't do anything to make people like him more. You know what I mean? Like to me, that's just so strange. Like if all I care about is people's approval, I'm going to do things to make people approve of me. And then that's why I thought it was just strange that there were so many times where he had this opportunity to appeal to even some of his fiercest critics, and he just doubled down on the base. He's like, no, 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 this is cancel culture. This is throwing out just buzzwords and stuff that had no substance to basically defend himself. Anyways, I have to go for like 2 minutes. Is that all right? Like I'll be
Yeah,
right. Okay. Thanks.
yep, no worries.
One sec.
All right, so welcome back.
Oh, thank
Um,
you.
that little break gives us a good opportunity to segue into our next topic, which is that of Vladimir Putin and his alleged $1 billion Black Sea mansion.
Yeah.
So Alexei Navalny and his team put out a video a couple days after, or I'm not sure how long after his arrest, when he
Yes.
returned to Russia in
Basically, what's
January. So in the video, it features this Black Sea palace, which supposedly has all kinds of crazy features. Like it's supposed to have a private casino, a skating rink, a vineyard. But of course, Vladimir Putin is denying any sort of connection, both himself or through any family, to the property.
Yeah.
So there's also some speculation that Vladimir Putin could even be the world's richest man, and it's just not publicly known. Like I've heard his net worth estimated roughly between 40 to 200 billion dollars, which is a pretty big window.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at right now who the richest man is officially, it would be Jeff Bezos with 182 million, or sorry, billion, not million. So if he was at the higher range of that window, about 200 billion, then he certainly would be the world's richest man. But I don't think there's as much financial transparency in Russia as there would be in other countries like the United States.
Yeah, I mean, Putin, he's amassed his fortune by basically running by running Russia like a mob. He basically says, hey, if you want to operate in Russia, you have to give me 50%. And that's not to say the Russian government. It's not, oh, give the government a 50% stake. It's give me 50% of your profits. And because these big companies, although many of them are legitimate, like Rosneft and oil and gas, it's just they do engage in shady practices like money laundering. There's drugs involved, all these kinds of things. And basically Putin gives them cover. And he says, we'll look the other way. There'll be no corruption probes as long as you give me my cut. But that cuts both ways. Of course, if you don't play ball, then they'll trump up the charges and they'll say, hey, you're corrupt. You're not operating correctly. Or they'll just blackmail you or whatever. And so that's how he maintains his grip. The Russian populace also puts up with a lot of shit. They're not the protests we've seen just recently, especially in terms of in favor of Navalny and against Putin. That's a somewhat recent phenomenon, and the size of those protests isn't enough to dramatically shift the balance of power in Russia. It's tough to say. What's going to happen eventually. Putin has clearly signaled that he wants to remain in power as long as physically possible. I mean, he's rewritten the Constitution multiple times. They interestingly recently passed a provision where ex-presidents are immune from criminal prosecution for the rest of their lives. I'm sure purely coincidental, right? Yeah, just super convenient. So, of course, you see that he has a lot of lackeys. He has a lot of people that are willing to prop him up and go along with this charade. And it just seems like there's not enough people in meaningful positions to shift that balance of power or to wrestle power away from him and his cronies.
I mean, he certainly didn't get there just overnight. He worked his way
No.
up through the Russian Secret Service. I mean, he's very intelligent. I believe he's fluent in both German and English as well as Russian.
Yep.
I mean, he definitely isn't the kind of person that you'd want to, mess with and take it lightly. I mean, Alexei Navalny, he was poisoned
Yeah.
for being a critic of Putin, and then I guess they said that the reason they arrested him in January because of some kind of parole violation.
Yeah.
But
He
I mean,
didn't he didn't check in with his parole officer while he was being treated for poisoning. He was
when he was in a
incapacitated.
coma, wasn't
Yeah,
he?
he was in a coma. Yeah, so he was incapacitated, and they used that as grounds for arresting him when he got back to Russia. So of course,
That's
on the surface, that that's complete crap already. But of course, right? Putin can't just come out and say, "Hey, we're arresting this guy because he's speaking out against me."
yeah.
So at least he gets some people to kind of go along with it by saying, "You didn't check in with your parole officer, therefore you're being detained. Off to the Gulag."
Now, is he still in custody?
Yep. Well, he's been transferred to a penal colony system, which is basically the 21st century Gulag. Slightly
Like a
better.
labor camp?
I don't know how much labor is involved, but yeah, you can read up on their penal system because I know most of them are located in Siberia, so it's quite north in Russia, very remote. So I imagine that there's quite a bit of secrecy shrouding specific camps.
Yeah.
They're not allowing the secrets or the treatment of the prisoners to be well known.
So it's
Well,
not a cliche that people get sent off to Siberia. So that is still an actual thing that happens a
Yeah.
lot.
Yep. And I mean, you have a country that, obviously, Russia being the world's biggest country, you have a lot of land to work with. And if you
Yeah,
want someone to disappear, it's quite easy to make someone disappear.
very true. And there's a lot of forests in Russia too, as well. Like, it's not just a big tundra or anything
No, no,
like
it's a
that.
very, very biodiverse region, especially in the south. I mean, when you look at the former Soviet Union, that included, Afghanistan, or well, it didn't include Afghanistan, but it included the neighboring regions, and then they invaded Afghanistan. But you look at places like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, all of those countries are quite diverse. They're much more in line, sort of with, um, I'd say almost Canadian climates, like out west. You know, you'll have a lot of
Kind of like a
mountains.
mountain.
You'll have, yeah, very mountainous regions. Um, yeah, just overall quite biodiverse. Sorry.
That's all right. A special guest, I suppose, there.
Yeah. Say hi, Archie.
So looking at how many billionaires there are in the world, as of 2019, there are 2,825 billionaires.
Oh, that
And
number's
as,
a lot.
pardon?
I said that number's gone up a lot. I think the last time I looked at it, they had only about 1,200 on that list. About five,
Really?
6 years ago. Yeah, it's been a pretty
Just 5 or 6
precipitous increase.
years ago? That's more
Maybe
than
I was
double.
looking at just American billionaires, or how many are there in the States?
I don't have the numbers for the states, but I can tell you that just in New York City alone, there's 113 billionaires, which is more than most countries.
Yep, and I imagine that many of those are international billionaires. They're not U.S. citizens.
And so would they just live in New York for business purposes,
Money
essentially?
laundering purposes, buying these big properties and stuff. I mean, New York is a really cool city. Like I visited there a couple of years ago, but it's a very exhausting city. It's not someplace I could live. Like it's pretty much like if you've been to Toronto, it'd be like comparing Chatham to Toronto, comparing Toronto to New York City. And it's just constant hustle and bustle. You'll hear traffic jams and horn honking at 3 in the morning on a Wednesday. So I think the big draw for these billionaires is just to kind of have a property, that mostly just sits empty for when they want to head on down for a few days at a time, because that's pretty much all you can handle that city for unless you're a born and raised New Yorker. So yeah, they really just serve as either investment properties, money laundering vehicles, or their vacation home when they decide to visit the States.
I mean, for ultra wealthy people like those, should there be a higher standard for transparency with what they're doing with their money, or should they have the same kind of rules as everybody else? Because with that level of money, I mean, certainly the things that you can do are far beyond that of the average person.
Oh, of course, yeah, and I think it really just comes down to, I don't think there's anything wrong with rich people using the tax code as it's written to, reduce their tax burden. If you're using legal means to reduce your taxes, and that's all you're on the hook for, that's all you're on the hook for, right? Obviously, the tax code favors those with wealth more than those without. But what becomes the big issue is when you have these ultra wealthy people putting in their input into the tax code and lobbying Congress or lobbying Parliament to say, hey, we want this provision and we want this write off and we want this deduction or whatever. That's when you're running into the problems, because that's when you're increasing that inequality well beyond just in terms of monetary value. You're not just saying, okay, well, this guy's got $1 billion and this guy's got 10 grand. It's like this guy's got $1 billion and every perk in the book. You can even look at how banks treat wealthy customers compared to poor customers. If you go to TD and you have a checking account for which you maintain a balance of over I think it's 5 grand every day of the month, you get a bonus. But meanwhile, if you're in your overdraft, you get charged for using your overdraft. If you don't have any money, you get an NSF fee. So basically, if you don't have the money, you're screwed, and if you have the money, you're hooked up beyond your wildest dreams. So
So it's just kind of set up to exacerbate the problems and
exactly,
continue
yeah,
widening.
yeah, all the benefits that would obviously more tangibly benefit the lower income folks actually go to the higher income folks. And I think it's interesting to talk about that in relation to things like tax breaks for wealthy people as opposed to stimuluses. So, one of the big debates in the States is typically people on the left and I guess even just moderate people, they don't believe in tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires, right? They think they have, well over what they'll ever need monetarily. So they think it's a waste and that the money could be better spent on sort of raising up the lower and middle classes through things like debt forgiveness, student loan cancellation, stimulus payments, these kinds of things. And I think they have a point in the sense of like, when you're a wealthy person, you're never waiting to purchase something you want. If you're a billionaire and you want a Mercedes, you're going out and buying a Mercedes. When you're when you're poor or you're socially and economically disadvantaged, you put things off, right? If you need a root canal, that comes at the expense of something else. You say, okay, well, we can't enroll my kid in hockey or something like that. And so you have people that, if they were given money or had their debt burden reduced, they'd immediately pump that back into the economy, right? You think about the number of people that are saying, hey, I'm not getting an oil change because I can't afford it. And then you hand them $100 and what do they immediately do? They go get an oil change. When you hand a millionaire $1 million, he throws it in an offshore savings account and just looks at the number. You know what I mean? There's no tangible economic benefit for the economy as a whole and the person. It's just, hey, stash more money away. And so I think that it's important to, introduce more perks for those who, go without these things and to help them out more so that you don't have this massive inequality gap.
Would there be a way to, I guess, motivate these rich business owners to keep their money in the country and put it back into the economy, maybe by like expanding their business or something like that?
A lot of what it comes down to is that you can avoid taxation. It gets really complicated, and obviously I'm not an accountant and I don't pretend to know all the ins and outs of it, but one of the big things is that if a company claims that it's taking a certain amount of money and investing it in R&D, so just any sort of research and development, they can avoid paying the taxes on that. So a lot of the times if Amazon, say, makes a profit and then they immediately turn around and say, well, that's going into R&D, they can avoid the taxation on that. Whereas if they were to take that profit and turn it into like a tangible employee benefit or like a profit sharing agreement with the employees, I think they're on the hook for more tax. And so, of course, the tax code was written such that these companies could, do this, right? So that they could just kind of hoard that money, claim that it's being thrown into R&D, and avoid the taxation. Of course, we look at that and say, well, your employees would appreciate it if you gave them that money instead. The economy would appreciate if you gave your employees that money so they could spend it on the things they need. So, it's a kind of a crappy system.
Was there any sort of way to actually ensure that these companies are using that money they're putting into R&D, or is it just possible that they're not actually doing anything?
Well, the whole thing is that the IRS actually admitted, I want to say 2 years ago now, that they focus the majority of their resources on those without money rather than those with money because of just the sheer cost of auditing, millionaires and billionaires and auditing their businesses and basically fighting with their, army of legal representatives, right? Whereas if you're talking about, so of course, when you're talking about a millionaire or a billionaire dodging taxes, the amount of money that is not being collected by the government is substantially larger. But basically what the IRS looks at is they say, okay, well, say we can recoup $1 million in taxation from these guys, but it's going to cost us $985,000 in legal fees. And, that's only a net of $15,000. Whereas they can say, hey, this guy who isn't all that well off, maybe cheated, he should have paid $20,000. He only paid $5,000. Going after him is easier. And then they end up netting the same amount of money, that same $15,000. So it's just like, that's how they look at it. And it's unfair because that just goes to show that they're exacerbating that inequality by only targeting those who can't afford the representation and can't afford to have an army of lawyers say, screw off, we're not paying it, or an army of accountants who can hide that money better. All these things. And so the IRS, basically the way you would enforce that is you would just pump more money into the IRS. You would make their focus less on those with low incomes and who lack assets, and focus more on those who have the money and have the assets. But that depends on people funding government services, which some people are very opposed to, right?
Yeah.
And nobody's a fan of the IRS. So even then, like, nobody's going to just say, hey, give my tax money to the IRS. The tax money, not even counting the tax money I already give to the IRS,
Right.
because I'm
Exactly.
forced to.
No, people are definitely very reluctant to pay more taxes. That's
Oh, yeah.
anybody really.
Well, I think,
Nobody's waking up in the morning and saying, I really hope that I end up being able to pay more taxes this
yeah,
year.
yeah, no, nobody's cutting a check to the treasury. No one's like, pay to the order of, take
Yeah.
more of my money.
No, it's good to save as much money as possible, but and if there's a way that you can in the long run end up saving money by actually targeting the people who should be targeted rather than just turning a blind eye to all these really wealthy people who are cheating their taxes, then, maybe hopefully at least you can then gain more access to a larger amount of money to then fund more services
Yeah,
while allowing these lower income people to have more of an equal chance, or not necessarily an equal chance, but just some chance in general of actually getting ahead and
yeah,
not just
exactly.
being down at every chance or at
Yeah,
every turn.
yeah, that's for sure.
So moving into cancel culture, we definitely hear a lot about it today. It's becoming pretty much unavoidable to go a day without hearing about something getting canceled. There's
Something.
plenty
Yeah.
of examples to draw from. So some recent examples, one that I would definitely be more quick to agree with than some of the others would be the Washington Redskins logo.
Yeah.
So that was what was controversial for a long time, and for quite a while, the team, they were pretty reluctant to change it. They're kind of dragging their feet, but this past season, they finally made the change. And they haven't selected a new logo yet. They're still just the Washington football team.
Yeah,
But
it's
what do
strange to
you
have it
think
in
about
one.
the change?
Well, I mean, I think it's a welcome change. I think as far as the Redskins go, it's pretty hard to defend just having a caricaturized native chief as your logo to just say we're Indians, But um, I think it's also like they haven't. I don't think that they've handled it as well as they could have, in the sense of like by leaving their team in limbo by having it just be called the Washington football team. I think you're giving a lot of ammo to people who were opposed to that change, and they may say, well, what the hell is this? Like, come up with a new logo, come up with a new team name, and then make the change, sort of thing. Whereas, I think a lot of people will view that as giving in to the mob, even though I agree with the change of the logo, by them just quickly scrapping the team logo, the branding, and just staying as the football team, Washington football team.
That
Um,
seems very lazy.
yeah, exactly. That's what I think too. And it just seems like it's a very almost like knee jerk reaction. It's not as well thought out.
How would you compare a logo like the Washington Redskins versus, say, a logo like the Chicago Blackhawks? Now, I heard the Blackhawks logo actually like incorporated some sort of guidance from local experts and that sort of symbology, right?
Yeah,
Is
well,
that true? Know anything about that?
I don't know anything about that specifically, but I certainly think it's much more, appropriate and I guess sensitive to take the input of, say, the Native Americans in that area and then say, are you guys comfortable with this? How would you like to be represented? All these things. Like it shows, a lot more compassion. Because I think the other side of it, and what kind of annoys me is when people almost get offended on behalf of other people without having that dialogue with that group of people, because then you don't know how they react, right? I remember reading that years and years ago, they wanted to quote unquote cancel the character of Speedy Gonzalez. Of course, Speedy Gonzalez is just a pure caricature of a Mexican, you know what I mean, sombrero and all, and mustache and whatnot. But it actually got a ton of pushback from the Latino community in America who were saying that they loved Speedy Gonzalez. And so I think it's important to, we use the term cultural appropriation to say, you know, the native, whatever native tribe that you're a part of, you're now just our logo, and we don't really give a shit about you. That's the cultural appropriation part, and I disagree with that. But if you're going to have a dialogue with those people and say, we want to incorporate you into our logo and into our business or company or whatever, that's completely different, and that's I think a lot more valid.
I would agree. I would agree. If there's if the people who are actually depicted in the logo aren't themselves offended, then it's really hard to argue in favor of removing the logo when
Exactly.
it's just
Yeah.
random people getting offended by it.
Yeah.
It just seems a lot more arbitrary in that case because, well, if it's not depicting you, what right do you really have to be offended by it? I mean,
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
not
And
your.
you're going to be offended on behalf of people who aren't offended. It's silly.
Yeah. Now, what would you say to the logos like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben? Because they've recently found their way off of the grocery shelves as well.
Yeah, I'm much less familiar with Uncle Ben, but I even remember about 10 years back, I had heard, I don't know if I was reading something online or if I was watching TV or something, but there was controversy around Aunt Jemima, and there wasn't widespread calls for removal of her depiction from the syrup bottles or to rebrand Aunt Jemima. But people were saying that it had racist connotations and racist origins. So I was kind of confused by that because I never really associated Aunt Jemima with anything negative. You know what I mean? Obviously, pure maple syrup's better, but I like Aunt Jemima. But then I looked into it, and it was just like, some of the old depictions of her were just like wow, like this is not okay. Like these are very outdated, very racist, stereotypical depictions of, a mammy character from a minstrel show. And so I think as far as Aunt Jemima goes, I don't know if I would have, like, I think Aunt Jemima, the Quaker Oats, they did enough in changing her appearance. And I think that, it begs the question, is it enough to change our logo and our brand to not have these depictions, or do we need to completely eliminate it because at one point we did have that depiction? And so I'm kind of more of the mind of, well, they changed the branding. The connotation isn't necessarily there. You'd have to know the historical background, and I think that that's sufficient in a lot of the cases.
I
Clearly,
would
they
agree with you there.
yeah, clearly they didn't think so because now they're the pearl milling company or something terrible. But as far as Uncle Ben
Yeah.
goes, I don't know really much about the controversy around him or how the character originated.
I honestly didn't know too much about either one, which kind of goes to speak in particular to the Aunt Jemima case, because, like you said, if you don't know the historical background, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to take it off the shelves now, when really the problem, from based on what you're saying, was past depictions of the logo.
Yeah, yeah, and so I mean the character did have quite racist origins because it was basically like we'll get any fat black woman to play this character at our trade shows and our world fairs and stuff, and basically pimp out a human to be the mascot at very little pay, in poor
Yeah.
conditions and all these kinds of things. And so that's the part that it's a very dark part of history, and I can understand the company wanting to shed that entirely by removing any trace of that. But I think it's also important to recognize that things can change over time, and if you allow people to change and all these things, then we'll live in a better society. If you just assume that people are just going to be how they are, or yeah, I don't know. I think it's
Well,
just
I see the comparison you're making there. Like it does sort of send a better message to actually make an effort to fix something rather than to just completely scrap
right.
it.
Exactly, yeah, yeah, and I think that
And
that
like, well, like you said, they did make changes and they made an effort to try and improve the logo, and it would seem like, I guess in the court of public opinion, that's not going to be quite enough. So, I mean, you got to ask yourself, is that the same sort of standard that we're applying to people, to actual human beings who have
yeah.
like feelings and emotions?
Yeah, no, and I think it's an important thing to look at. I just think that as far as cancel culture is concerned, or just the notion of it shouldn't be confused with holding people accountable for wrongdoing. And I think that's what happens in a lot of cases. Like you have to look at these things case by case. Like we've talked about, mostly we've been talking about cases where it's warranted, where we're talking about, the Redskins logo or Aunt Jemima and stuff like that. But of course there are times where it's overblown and it's not worth it. But we can't just say, oh, this is overblown. I'm not going to bother learning about this, right? Because then you're just ignorant. You know what I mean? Like if you don't, it's one thing to not know about the Aunt Jemima controversy or the history of Aunt Jemima, but it's another thing to be entirely unwilling to learn that history and say this is BS. I don't care. You're taking away my precious corn syrup. Like I think it's silly like that. But it's also talking about people using cancel culture. I was actually just reading only probably about an hour ago, Cuomo saying that efforts to oust him or get him to resign are cancel culture. And I shook my head so hard at it because it's like, dude, don't stoop to that level where you think that any level of accountability or expectations of you, in your conduct is just some angry mob coming at you for no valid reason. Like it's not the case. And I just think that there are too many people out there that confuse, witch hunting with holding people accountable.
Well, I've heard some people make the comparison online recently between Cuomo and Pepe Le Pew. And of course, Pepe Le Pew did actually get canceled recently, I think a couple of days ago. So it's an interesting comparison to make,
Yeah, I think
considering the outlets. And
with Pepe Le Pew, like, I've seen a lot of comparisons online between Pepe Le Pew and other subjects that they just don't really hold up. Like, I think the biggest thing with Pepe Le Pew is you're talking about a show that's geared specifically to children with a character who is constantly harassing a skunk, right? The female
yeah,
skunk. And so it's like, I was watching the clip from Dave Chappelle in 2000 where he's talking about he's sitting down to watch Looney Tunes with, I don't know if it was his nephew or whatever. And he was just saying, yeah, it's Pepe Le Pew. I thought it was funny when I was a kid or whatever. And then basically
so did
plays
I,
out as if,
honestly. Think
yeah,
anything
well,
of it.
and it plays out as if, Dave Chappelle's talking. And he's like, but man, watching that years later, that guy is one rapey guy, like, and then he's talking about how, the kid thinks that that's an appropriate behavior or whatever. And he's like, no, 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 no. So I don't think that to look at Pepe Le Pew and say, yeah, we shouldn't be peddling this to kids anymore I don't think it's bad to say that. Like, I'd probably agree with it. But I remember watching Looney Tunes and sort of knowing that I shouldn't be that way, So I think
Yeah.
it doesn't give much credit to the audience to just assume that everyone thinks, oh, well, this is how I should act, and I should, grope people and not talk and or not ask for consent or whatever.
Right. I wouldn't go as far as saying the show tries to glorify the behavior at all.
No, no, and in every circumstance, he's shown to be a loser. You know what I mean? Like he's never painted in a positive light. And what really got me the other day was I saw somebody had made like a collection of graphics where they were clearly altered to show as if the skunk liked Pepe Le Pew's advances. And I'm just like, how desperate are you to defend a 70-year-old character that you make photoshopped images to show, oh no, he wasn't a rapey guy. It's just like, I don't know. I don't get the emotional attachment to a lot of these things. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I'm like, if you want to cancel something, or if a publisher of a Dr. Seuss book wants to stop publishing a Dr. Seuss book, whatever. Like, what's the alternative? Am I going to get the government to force you to make a book that I want to read? Like what's the answer to
That's a
that?
good point. And when you put it like that, I guess I didn't really think of that. Like, you can't force somebody to produce something. That's true.
Yeah. Because, yeah, like I would certainly be opposed to the government saying, you have to make this book. I'd be like, excuse me? No
Yeah.
thanks.
Well, I guess as a publisher, you probably should have the right to decide what books
Yeah.
you are going to publish under your name or not.
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but isn't like one of the big distinctions between things like social media and like an actual publisher, the fact that a publisher can be held legally accountable for the content that goes out under their brand?
I believe so, but I think that would only really apply to like slander and libel. So, if
Okay.
you can prove something to be entirely, false about a certain person and it's detrimental to their character, then you'd have grounds to sue. But the thing with Section 230, which is the specific, provision that basically gives companies like Twitter and Facebook the ability to host content that's posted by other people without being legally held responsible for the content itself. The thing is, if that got repealed, these companies would stop hosting it entirely. Like I think a lot of conservatives seem to think that it would mean, they couldn't say what's on their platform or not, but it would mean the opposite. It would mean they'd clamp down incredibly hard on things
Yeah.
like, anything that they perceive to be unsavory content, because now they're legally responsible for it. So I think it's something that people push for without really understanding the implications of it, and the implication being something that they would actually not want at all. They're
Well,
not
I've
very
heard
well
Tim
thought solutions.
I've heard Tim Pool talk a lot about this on his podcast. Like what he mentions is if Section 230 got repealed, websites like YouTube, like the very nature of them would just be completely dead because what would happen is, well, since YouTube could be held legally accountable for what people publish on their website, what they would probably do is select a few publishers, like content creators that they actually can rely on, that they can count on not to create content that would get them in any sort of legal trouble.
Yeah.
And it would probably just become more like a streaming service, I guess. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's probably what would happen.
Well, I mean, you already have, like, YouTube is incredibly forward when it comes to demonetizing videos that they don't feel, fits what advertisers want. If there's excessive language, if there's anything sexual in it, if there's, even like clickbait thumbnails nowadays, you can't have something like, some girl with her boobs in the camera, you know what I mean? Because they immediately see that thumbnail, and regardless of if there's any content in the video relating to that, they're going to demonetize you. And you don't really have a leg to stand on when they explicitly say, hey, we don't accept this, and you're trying to say, well, monetize my video. It's like, well, it's not up to them, or well, it is up to them, but they're not going to do it.
Well, I've heard there's certain words and even like a couple of names that you can say that'll get your video like immediately taken down. Like one of them is the whistleblower from the US. Like I'm not like super familiar with the story, but there's maybe 2020 or 2019 somebody
it was from
was
the
a
impeachment,
whistleblower.
yeah.
Yeah, don't say the name obviously, but I guess that's one of the names where if you say that, your video will get taken down.
Yeah, well, that's because it's
That's what
also
I've heard.
illegal to out whistleblowers. So,
That makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
That makes a lot of sense then. But I mean,
What Rand Paul did was he hid behind the fact that there's a rule in the U.S. I don't know if it's in the Constitution or if it's just a long-standing law, but basically anything can be read into the record on the House or Senate floor, and the person who does it isn't held legally responsible for it. So he just used that platform to out the whistleblower because it was the one circumstance where he could do it and not face legal consequences. So it's just like, okay, but
that's a pretty shady tactic. But
yep. But
so now that he's already outed, it's still illegal to mention his, well, not necessarily illegal, but I don't know, what would be the legal parameters around that? I'm not super familiar with those sorts of
I mean,
things.
I don't think, because obviously if it was classified information, you'd be in hot water for disclosing that. But I think, like, you can't really get in trouble for somebody publicly outing somebody and knowing about it. You know what I mean? Like, you just by virtue of knowing who it is or knowing their name, there's nothing to penalize you on. I think one of the bigger concerns, and it's a very valid concern, is the doxing of that person or the targeting of that person. Okay, you got the name, you got their address, you got their phone number, family, etc. So, I think it's, I mean, I don't really understand the obsession with, outing somebody who just said, hey, this is wrong, this is illegal, this is how it's illegal, and I'm telling you about it. Like, to me, that's kind of like, like you're in the mob, snitches get stitches or something. So I don't necessarily agree with it. But
Do you think sometimes, I guess we already mentioned this a little bit, the cancel culture goes too far, like specifically with the example of Donald Trump being banned on Twitter. I mean, there's other political figures such as Nicolas Maduro, who is, of course, the dictator of Venezuela. There's some very notorious conditions in that country right now with their economy and the living conditions people experience. Do you agree with those sorts of, I guess you could call them inconsistencies with criticizing political leadership?
the important thing to remember is that I believe in 2018, Twitter changed its terms of service to no longer apply to world leaders. Basically, they could flag tweets to say, this goes against our terms of service and against our policy, but because it's being made by our world leader, it's in our best interest to allow you to see it. And then it also sort of just, opens up questions about censorship, right? Should you not be able to know what your government leader is saying, if he chooses to use Twitter as a platform or something? But that's the important thing to remember, is that Trump, regardless, of his standing, broke the terms of service as they were written. And Jack Dorsey and Twitter as a whole said,
once this guy's out of office, he'll be banned from the platform. We can't ban him as president because it's in the public interest to see his tweets. But the only caveat was that you couldn't incite violence. So Trump didn't get banned from Twitter until the 6th when he tweeted about Pence when they had erected the gallows on the Capitol grounds and saying, Mike Pence doesn't have the guts to do what's right. And then that's when they stormed in and started chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." So that's when he got into hot water. So somebody like Maduro, obviously when you look at the country he leads and what he's done to that country, objectively worse. But until he's calling for violence or something that can be construed as calling for violence on Twitter, he's okay. So it's not necessarily an inconsistency as far as that goes. But yeah, I mean, the only time you really get into kind of a gray area is this directly inciting violence? Is this implicitly inciting violence? And that's its own debate, I guess.
It is. It's a big debate because a lot of people would say, of course, Donald Trump incited violence directly, and then there's a lot of other people who would say, well, no, I think people misconstrued his message. What do you think about that?
Well, there's the thing is like you're talking about disrupting a specific electoral process, right? Like you're talking about storming in to stop the certification of an election in the hopes that those people will reverse it in your favor. You're not protesting an idea, right? Like it's one thing for Trump supporters to descend upon Washington, D.C., during Biden's inauguration or during the certification and just protest the idea of Trump losing, to just be like, this sucks, we the people, we the silent majority or whatever they want to call themselves, we believe in him, this is what it is, but we're voicing our discontent. And that's completely fine, right? And as long as there's no violence involved, there's really no problem with that. And protests like that happen in D.C. constantly. But when you're talking about a specific process, that the whole thing is that the premise of what they're doing is inevitably violent. Like what, did you think you were going to descend upon the House floor and sing Kumbaya and they would give the election to Trump? Like, no, the only way you had any prayer of accomplishing your goal was to intimidate and to hurt people and force them to do it. So I think it's one of the rare circumstances where you can look at it as, hey, it's not like he said, hey, go and, fuck them up. But it's also like, what did you think was going to happen? Like it's not a mystery that it would turn violent. And I think that not being able to see, like, because really there were millions of people, obviously not that many that were actually there, but there were millions of people that wholeheartedly believed an election was stolen. That's like a free and fair election is the only thing that stops us from becoming a Belarus or Sudan or something, right? Is just the belief and the trust in democracy. And so when you have someone sowing distrust in that because he doesn't like the outcome and not because he has any valid reason, then you really jeopardize that. And when millions of people wholeheartedly believe that an election was stolen and an illegitimate president's being installed because they wanted to stop Donald Trump, like that's inevitably violent. Like they're not going to just show up and say, hey, pretty please with a cherry on top, inaugurate Trump again. It's not going to happen. So I think that it just kind of seems like people aren't seeing the connection there. And they think that, he didn't say it directly, therefore he didn't incite it. And it's like, it's not that easy.
And you remember the QAnon shaman, of course. It's hard to forget a character like that.
That was
I don't know what he was thinking when he decided to show up in that costume. Like, well, I guess he's shown up to other demonstrations just like that before. It's like kind of his shtick.
Yeah, I guess.
But anyways, in court, one of his arguments against the charges that he's facing is that he was waved in by one of the security officers. Because they were waving people in some areas. Like, it was different at every entrance a little bit.
Yeah.
But there is there is an argument around, like, circulating around as well, that a lot of the people there weren't necessarily there specifically to disrupt things. They were kind of swept up in the chaos of everything. Like they were there at the rally, they got involved with this large group that's then marching down, and then here they are entering the Capitol.
Yeah.
And they kind of just
and that was big,
sort of developed maybe a mob mentality, I guess you could say, or I suppose, what would you call that? What would you call it when people kind of just go along with what everyone else is doing?
The crowd, yeah. I mean, really, it's just mob mentality. Yeah, and I mean, and that was a big focus of the investigation is, was it not an inside job, but were there people in positions of power, whether it being lawmakers or Capitol Police or, members of the Pentagon that were involved in a deliberately slow response or actually ushered protesters in. And so there are a couple videos where you can see Capitol Police basically waving people through, which would be a huge break in protocol and would be like unconscionable, because why on earth would you, for a building that's been closed for tours for months because of the pandemic, why are you waving in hundreds of people that are specifically there to disrupt the ongoing proceedings in the building? Like, and so that's the big problem is a lot of these people that they've arrested, they have military experience, they're veterans, they've been in high up governmental positions, and I think it really adds to the realness of it, right? To realize that there are people that are in positions of power that believed in this and that would be willing to go along with it. And I mean, that's where, you talk about an insurrection or a coup, and it's like, if you have people on the inside in positions of power willing to orchestrate that, well, then that's when you go from, an electoral disruption to an attempted coup.
Yeah, that would be very serious indeed if that was what's happening. I mean, is there any sort of, like you mentioned, people in high political positions? What would be like some, I haven't really heard any names.
Yeah, so there was a State Department aide who was arrested and charged, and who was present at the Capitol during the attack. What I've read so far from the investigation is that they haven't pinned any wrongdoing on the individual lawmakers. There was some controversy because one of the GOP QAnon-aligned Congresswoman, Lauren Boebert, she at one point tweeted that Nancy Pelosi had been removed from the chambers. And so it's kind of like, why are you, like, what's the relevance of informing people about that during an ongoing insurrection? So, there's some sort of, there's that angle where it's like, is that kind of what you're doing? Arguably, is it enough to say this is definitively what you're doing and we're charging you on the grounds of that? No. And so I know that it's still an ongoing investigation, and a lot of the roles that they're looking into, or a lot of the, so that they're looking into Pentagon leadership. So, for example, Michael Flynn, Trump's former national security advisor. Of course, there's the whole thing with the first impeachment, and that's its whole own saga. But basically, Trump granted him a pardon. He immediately went on Twitter and basically called for everybody to descend upon the Capitol and help out Trump. But the thing was his brother was at a high leadership position in the Pentagon, and supposedly he had a hand in ensuring that the Pentagon response was slow, because supposedly it took 3 hours for the deployment of the National Guard. Supposedly Mike Pence gave the go-ahead for the National Guard when that would entirely fall to Trump. So basically it would have been Trump didn't call the National Guard, which does not look good on him, right? If, it's one thing to say, hey, I got a little carried away, you guys are being violent, stop it, we're sending in the big guns to quell this. But it's another thing to go, no, we'll see how this plays out. It's like, okay, well then it seems like you're pretty gung-ho about this whole install you as a dictator thing, so that's not good. But yeah,
Trump
those are
was a
probably
little
the two.
MIA for a bit.
What's that, sorry?
I remember Trump was a little MIA for a few hours, wasn't he, during the riots there?
Yeah, well, he was in the White House watching it, and there's a clip of him watching it with Trump Jr., and they're like, they aren't upset. It's just like, what the hell? Anyway, I suppose we've kind of strayed from our main topic being the cancel culture, but that's okay.
Well, this is kind of related to it. This is kind of related to it in a sense, because a big part of why Trump was banned off of Twitter was related to the events of January 6th. And
Yeah.
it definitely sets a very interesting precedent where a world leader is being accused of such things, and then at the same time, their ability to defend themselves is being taken away as well. So it creates a situation where I think people are probably only going to get more polarized, because you've got one set of people who wholeheartedly believe Trump and a lot of what he's saying, and you have the other side who believe quite the opposite. They believe they don't believe anything that he's saying, or they think he's the worst person ever.
Well, I
So
think
I
it.
think the
Sorry.
current situation where he can't like have a public platform to talk and have people actually hear what he's saying, it doesn't let people think for themselves and actually, critically think, okay, well, am I agreeing with what he's saying?
Yeah.
Whereas you kind of just get the highlight reel edited out of context, either way, either in a positive light or a negative light.
Yeah, and I think the issue. I mean, you talk about kind of setting a precedent, but at the end of the day, it goes back to our discussion about, does a private company have to host things that they, don't agree with? And it's really, a function of the free market that these companies become so powerful, right? Companies like Facebook, when you have 2 billion users, many of whom are not smart enough to know fact from fiction, conspiracy from reality, you have that as its own issue. But then again, it's like, should these companies then be forced to host content they don't agree with simply by virtue of the fact that they were successful enough? Because then you could argue, like, right, we saw the rise of Parler in the aftermath of the Capitol riot, basically a right-wing version of Twitter where they could all congregate or whatever. But then you recognize that it doesn't have the reach of Twitter. It doesn't have that immediate impact or that internet-wide impact. And so
Yeah.
I think, with like the thing with Trump is it's like he's a former president. If he wants to put out a statement, he can put out a statement, right? The vast majority of what he did on Twitter was shit posting. He didn't have anything of substance. It was just attacking people. It'd be like you'd go on and be like 6 a.m. He's just complaining about Bette Midler. It's just like, dude, you're the president of the United States. Like half the country's gonna hate you regardless of what you do. Just accept it. Like
Yeah.
stop trying to pick fights with every one of them. Like you just look like an idiot. Like it's just I don't know. I think it was just so immature and it was just ill-conceived because none of those, there were so many policies announced via Twitter. There were firings and hirings announced via Twitter where it's just so unprofessional. It's just the ramblings of a madman. And it's like, I don't think the world's worse for having him no longer on that platform. I think, the divisiveness and the rhetoric just isn't necessary. It doesn't help anything. But it goes to show just the power of the bubbles we live in now, right? You can go on Twitter and follow accounts that exclusively agree with you. You can go on Facebook and seek out things that just reinforce your pre-existing beliefs. If you want to believe Donald Trump is the be all end all, you can find a news outlet that speaks about him like that. And people
It's
just
even worse
choose
than
to do that.
that. If you go on YouTube and watch a video, for example, about a certain thing, then it's going to suggest 50 other videos about the same thing.
Yeah. And a lot of it, I mean, it really just gets circle jerky, right? It just becomes like, yeah, I get it. Like, screw the guy. Trump sucks. Or Trump's the best, right? It's not, it sort of becomes devoid of any sort of informative content. It just becomes like reinforcement of emotions, like, and I find myself getting that way sometimes when I, end up on a topic where I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole is it's like you start to get almost an emotional response to it. And then that's when you got to realize like, hey, I'm getting in too deep on this, like I can't allow this to start clouding my judgment or allow it to, color my beliefs in a way that doesn't represent me.
And that sort of thing can really have a negative impact on people's lives, even going as far as like disrupting their careers, their
Yeah.
relationships with friends and family.
Yeah.
Like I don't know if it's as bad in Canada as the States. Definitely not, probably. It's
No,
not as
I wouldn't say
divisive.
that.
I mean, I know in the States it's notorious that like people will like gather for Thanksgiving, for example, and get into huge fights with their family because one person's on one side and the other's on the other. And then
Well,
they just don't talk to each other.
yeah, and I've read quite a few, anecdotal things about that. But there's also a movie on Amazon. I think it's on Amazon Prime. It's called The Brainwashing of My Dad, and basically the premise of the movie is just there was this guy that watched his dad go from like a pretty like apolitical, he wasn't involved in politics, nice guy, family man, to just an angry, hate-filled guy, and it just became where everything had to be political. Everything was Fox News or Rush Limbaugh, and it was just like he just became a shell of himself because all he was seeing was this constant negative reinforcement, you know.
Yeah.
And then, so you've heard a lot of anecdotes about people just losing family members, or they can't have a conversation with a family member without it devolving into BS political stuff, and then that's when you have these problems, and you have it where you can't feel comfortable at Thanksgiving because you're just waiting for someone to pop off about a controversial topic. And I think that what by bringing these sort of outlets to the forefront, you have people thinking it's a lot more acceptable to talk about these topics, right? They always say, what are the 4 topics you don't talk about at the dinner table? Is religion, abortion, politics, economics. It's like you just avoid them. But when you have the acronym RAPE, religion, abortion, politics, economics, just remember that.
Who came up with that acronym?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Probably, yeah. It's easy to remember, that's for sure. But
Yeah.
yeah,
It is.
it brings that content to the forefront, and that becomes the only focus, and then people have nothing else to talk about, right? If all you're watching is hate shows, where it's just like, hey, look at how crappy the left is, look at how crappy the right is, eventually that just becomes who you are, and it's sad to see it. But I think it is certainly a much more pronounced phenomenon in the States than in Canada, thankfully, but of course that could change.
Well, I think a part of what helps us here in Canada is our multi-party system. So there's not as much like one side versus another because like while you have the liberals and conservatives, you've also got the NDP, you've got the Green Party, you've got the Bloc Québécois. Like
And
there's
it's
so
just
many different parties.
and it's just so much less a part of people's identity, right? Because in the U.S., you
True.
just have people that they're like, I'm Republican because my dad was Republican, and it's just like, why don't you look at what their platforms are, think about what you agree with, and then come to a decision? Because then that's when you just have this team sport mentality where you're never holding anybody accountable and you're just attacking the other side, right? And nowadays, like I think cancel culture is basically an extension of that, where it's like, hey, now we have an excuse to never look at our own behavior and correct it because we can just say, oh, it's the haters, it's the radical left, the woke mob coming to cancel us, and it's like, no, not necessarily. I mean, yeah, sure there are crazies, but at the end of the day, you should strive for accountability. You should strive to elect people into positions where they're going to help you or do the things that you want, and don't just go into it blindly. Because when you talk to people in the States about specific issues without regard to the position of a Democrat or a Republican, you'll find they agree a lot of the time. Like it's a very much like they can agree on the basic premise of it. But then you look at who they vote for, and then you see, oh, that's not part of their platform. And it's like, well, I'm not going to vote for the other guy because they're evil. And it's like, well, the thing you want is part of their platform. So if you just take away the emotion from it, your life can be improved. Vote for the people that actually represent you and do what you want. I don't know.
So what's that movie called? I'm kind of curious about it. I might have to check that out. And you said it's on Amazon Prime?
Yeah, it's the brainwashing of my dad. I'm pretty sure the
Okay.
thumbnail is just it's like the guy sitting in front of a TV and it's like pushing waves into his face.
That
Yeah.
sounds interesting. I saw a Polish movie probably last winter, I think maybe like last March or April, I can't remember when, but it's called Hater, I think. It's a Polish film, and it kind of just centers around like this guy who starts working for essentially what you would call like a troll farm, where
Mm.
they create social media accounts and try to like steer people's
Yeah.
opinions in one particular direction.
Yeah.
And it ends up taking this totally crazy, sinister turn where by the end of the movie, he ends up inciting a mass shooting by manipulating this like really fringy political guy online into committing it.
Jeez.
It's crazy. It's actually a really intense movie. I would recommend it.
Yeah. Well, I'd have to check that out.
Yeah. And
Yeah. I
I'll
mean,
have to check out what you recommended.
yeah. I mean, it is a phenomenon of our existence is that there are people that are just very easily manipulated. I'd love to believe that we don't need any limits on these things because people can think critically and see through a lot of BS. But the problem is you have people who manipulate them. They try to get them to buy into BS and not think about it. You know what I mean? Or they take a topic that the person only knows a little about and fills their head with a bunch of lies because they don't know any better. You know what I mean? Like, for example, like I know very little about cars. You know what I mean? Like you could tell me a lot of stuff. If you're a car guy, you could tell me stuff that's pure BS, and I'd probably be like, oh, I mean, yeah, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like it's just when you don't know very much about a topic, it lends itself to allowing you to be manipulated by those who do and those who who use logical fallacies and things like that to get you to buy into the BS they're peddling because it advances their political ambitions or it makes them money.
Yeah, and you do see a lot of incentive to push more and more, I guess, controversial topics because that's typically what generates more traffic.
Exactly. Yep. There's a reason why these 24-hour news cycles they survive. Breaking news doesn't happen every minute of the day. So if a network is on 24/7, there's going to be a lot of reiteration of stuff, which just makes you more mad. There's going to be a lot of opinion shows that go over past things where it's just it's devoid of any real informative content, but it just basically exists as a circle jerk to reinforce people's beliefs. And that's the exact opposite of what the news should be about. The news should be about informing you, giving you the cut and dry, the straight and narrow, and not, I just think the whole thing is that the news should be, this happened, this person said this, that. The news shouldn't be, Republicans react to Democrats saying this. It shouldn't be based on the reactions of people. It should be about the information, because that's where they get you, right? If they just tell you the straight and narrow and they just tell you the facts, you can form your own opinion. You can't do that if they're basically telling you what to think, or they're delivering the news in such a tone to imply that it's bad. I remember watching this segment. It was about education in Denmark. It was Laura Ingram on Fox News. And so she's giving the basic premise of what happens in Denmark, that the tax money pays for post-secondary education. But the entire time she's saying it, she's like, oh, school in Denmark's free. Sounds great, right? It's like she's telling her audience what to think about it. Because she knows that if she just actually says it to them in a neutral tone, they might go, oh, we should have that over here. Because her ultimate goal isn't to inform these people about it, it's to mislead them into believing what she believes. And then what happened with this whole segment was that a Danish politician actually came out and kind of debunked it, point by point, to say, this isn't bad, this isn't controversial, all these other things. And it's like, the problem is the people who need to see that correction the most don't, right? She thrives off of peddling misinformation. And because she's acting in bad faith and doesn't believe this stuff, she's not going to go, oh, yeah, sorry, I had it all wrong. This is how it actually is. Because she doesn't want to give people the facts. She wants to manipulate people into believing what it is she's peddling. And that's what I disagree with, because I don't care what part of the political spectrum you're on or what belief you have, but I care if you actually believe your own bullshit, right? I can disagree with you policy-wise till I'm blue in the face, and that's totally fine. But when you're refusing to acknowledge that you're wrong about something or change your mind on something, and instead you just double down on logical fallacies and misinformation and manipulation, I can't respect that. And that's regardless of what you believe. I mean, you can agree with me 100% politically, but if that's how you go about, informing people of your views, I can't stand by that.
That's a pretty good standard to have, I think. It's important that people try to think for themselves. And I heard one popular YouTuber, JP Sears, put it like this: that people are outsourcing their information a lot of the time and their opinions.
Yep. Well, it's like
so rather than thinking for themselves, they're watching, inflammatory content. They're watching some sort of political dictator, and then they just adopt whatever they're telling them.
Yeah. Well, Carl Sagan, the famous physicist, he has a great quote. So he died in the late 90s, but he has a quote, I believe, from 95, where he's talking about just the dumbing down of American media. And this is way before social media. I mean, he would be rolling in his grave if he saw this. But, he's talking about that these 30-minute news segments are now down to 20-second sound bites or less. There's no actual desire to understand anything about the topic, beyond, surface level information. You have people who, and he goes on to talk about just how, because it's all devoid of critical thinking and you don't equip these people to understand these topics, basically you're left just consulting your horoscopes and, clutching your crystals and saying, think for me, right? And that's how you turn into an easily manipulated, scared person, right? Because all these people are just terrified, right? They don't understand things. They don't know how to start to understand things, but they take a lot of comfort in the man on the TV telling them it's going to be all right, or it's somebody else's fault. Two of them, who can I blame for my current position? Or how is it not my fault, basically?
I've heard before that a lot of people just simply like being told what to do rather than having to think out a plan for themselves.
Yeah, no, it's very true. There's plenty of people who, follow that, and they want a leader to
Yeah.
look up to, and somebody who's strong in their eyes, and somebody who can say, you know, like, there was somebody on Reddit who made a really good point during Trump's presidency, where Trump to a lot of people is basically like the action figure or the nightlight, right? When you're dealing with a kid who doesn't understand anything, right, and he's afraid of the dark, you can't tell the kid there's nothing to be afraid of because their fear isn't based on anything rational, right? You don't get a kid to stop being afraid of the dark by saying, suck it up, there's nothing wrong with it, right? You give them a nightlight or you give them a little G.I. Joe because it makes them feel better, right?
Yeah.
It's purely emotional. It doesn't solve the problem, but it makes it feel like it solves the problem. And Trump was like that for a lot of these people because they didn't understand the economy, they didn't understand immigration, they didn't understand taxation, any of these things. But they had a guy who sounded like them and looked like them to tell them it was all going to be okay. And that was enough for them, right? If you don't know a lot about these subjects and you put your trust in public officials to tell you about these subjects, you don't question it, right?
Yeah, we see that a lot. We see that a lot today.
Yeah.
I think that's probably a good spot to close it off. We've been going on for
Oh, yeah, no kidding.
100 minutes. It's been good. We're getting pretty deep into this topic about cancel culture, which is
Yeah.
funny because what I have the least amount of notes on.
It was one I knew that we could build a conversation from the most, I'd say. So
Well, I
I'll,
mean, I was a little bit worried about it going into it just because I don't want to get canceled talking about cancel culture. Say something
the ultimate
stupid. But
irony. Hey,
anyways, thank you for coming on the podcast. It was
thanks for
a
having
great
me.
talk that we had here. Covered
Yeah,
some
man, for sure.
very interesting things happen in the world.
Yeah, I'm
Maybe time to have you on again.
yeah, man, I'm interested in seeing the finished product and hoping I don't come off like an idiot.
I don't think
Once
you
the
will. I don't think
okay,
so.
good. Once the awkward silences and me leaving for a minute there are cut out, maybe it'll be more cohesive.
All right. Well, thanks again. Enjoy
Thank
the
you.
rest of your day.
Thank you,
And
sir.
be sure to subscribe, everybody, if you haven't already, and like this video, and stay
Yeah.
tuned for future content.